You're listening to DBK and Insar on Heritage Radio.
Hello, assalamu alaikum. Hello to everybody out there. Thank you for tuning into our lovely show, and we hope to entertain you. And some lovely tracks there. That was the first one was Behind the Waves by Alman Nusra. I think that's our best track we've played so far.
Yeah, I've got to say, bro, you are becoming quite the connoisseur of nasheeds. And that is a sentence I never thought I'd hear myself say.
I know.
So you know what, bro? Sorry, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to be a little sarcastic. Such a religious person like yourself, you know, it's amazing.
Yeah, well, you know, we are very spiritual. Yeah, you know what? I think today I thought let's give the trending news stories a little rest, cause I mean, unless you've got anything on your mind.
No, I think today, because we had the general election, people have been out there voting, and I was going to talk about the whole concept of democracy in this country. I mean, we've had a look at democracy in the US and or lack of democracy in the US and what it gains and not gains for people. I mean, it's quite true now that 50% of the population do not vote anymore. You know, and why? Maybe because they're apathetic or lethargic, or maybe they just give up on the whole kind of democratic process, because nothing really changes for people on under a certain wage limit, if you know what I mean. You know, the kind of ups and downs of, say, the interest rates and, you know, inflation. How does that affect somebody on 12,000 a year?
Yeah,
you know,
a lot.
A lot.
The answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go on.
Well, I mean, okay. There's a really impressive graph that was generated that I'm going to try and describe, which is probably the worst radio that I could imagine. But I'm still going to try and do it. Imagine a graph. So on the horizontal line, you've got let's see. The GDP growth, right? And that can be either positive or, as we know on a graph, it can be negative. And then on the other axes, you've got wage growth, right? So I can tell I'm boring you already.
No. I understand totally. You have a wage growth, but there's a difference between a living wage and a minimum wage.
I predicted you didn't hear what I said, because I'm saying both. Like, this is a really important thing. It's so on one axis it's the GD, it's the growth of the economy, of the country, and then on the other is the growth of wages. Right. So on the top right corner, and I think we'll put a link to this on our Facebook page. But there's you can see all these countries are pacing ahead. You've got USA and Spain and Japan and pretty much every industrialized country. The economy is slowly growing, and people's wages are slowly growing. And then in a recession scenario, you have people where the recession's shrinking, and there's a few countries where the wages are shrinking. But the UK is one of the only countries where the economy is growing, but the income is actually reducing on average.
You know, I mean, what causes that? Because you can say cronyism, corruption, but it's actually policies that are made that kind of affect people in big ways. And you know, the wages not kind of increasing. You can look at that as in 0 hours, you know, part-time work, 1 year contracts, and it gives a lot of power to employers rather than employees. You know, there was a time when the employees had a lot of rights. You know, if your employer took advantage of you, you know, there were ways and means to kind of face up to them and have your fair share of the justice system. But in this day and age, when you have a lack of workers' rights, I think that you can see now with the wages of reduction or plateauing, that lack of wages of workers' rights kind of equates to lack of low wages as well.
Bro, forget the justice system. I want some money, yo. No, that's a fair point. So I'm going to try and find that graphic, because I think that description I gave made your eyes glaze over. Bro, I know when your eyes glaze over, that is it. You have lost it.
No, you're absolutely right.
Here we go.
There was one thing I was kind of disagreeing with. I thought a lot of Western countries had the same kind of pattern.
I thought that, yeah.
You know, that especially the US, when you see a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and this kind of criticism of capitalism running rampant, you know, and you would think that wages had actually decreased. But, you know, that reminds me, in America, you had these huge strikes, people working in fast food chains and minimum wage jobs, they actually came out and brought these companies to a standstill.
Yeah.
And I think that is the only way, as Chris Hedges says, your only avenue of retaliation against the system is the street. You have to come out and demonstrate.
I'm going to quickly read out so I've actually found the link. So, bro, I want you to look at this graph as well while we're talking about it. But this is from a Facebook page called Another Angry Voice. And it says, this is one of the most outrageous subjects I've wrote about in the last month. British workers are getting the worst deal in the developed world because they're the only workforce to see the value of their wages falling. Right. So the value, so that means like the effects of their spending power. It's not just their wages. It's I think in terms of expenditure as well. So they're the only people in the developed world to see the value of their wages falling while the economy is growing. What do you think of that?
That's very interesting, because I thought the UK was doing very well for the standard of living, which it is, but the cost of living is going higher and higher. And of course, everyone says the wages are staying the same.
So this graph is from 2007 to 2015, and it is from the OECD. And let's see. So, bro, I mean, you can see, like, for example, Portugal and Italy, you can see they've got negative growth in the economy. And as you'd expect, they've got negative wage. Let's see, it's wage growth.
This comes to the point. I mean, where is the so-called free press? Where is journalism? Why is this not highlighted in the media as it should be? Because you don't really hear much about this. Like I say, you hear much about the minimum wage and the difference between that and the living wage and the high cost of living. But when you see something as kind of graphic has that, part of my point, it shows that there's something fundamentally wrong in this country.
I think that's the first time a pun has been used in a GDP annual growth rate graph. But this is actually important to say. This is between 2007 and 2015, and so this is historical, and that is during one of the worst recessions in living memory. So maybe the statistics are skewed in a way that isn't reflexive of reality. But a little thing to note is you've got Denmark, you've got Finland, you've got Latvia, Spain and Slovenia with moderate reductions in the economy, but still a growth in the real, let's see, the annual real wages compound growth rate is what technically is a phrase.
All right, I mean, let's look at this country for a moment. Now, we know there's a lot.
Bro, we're the only one that has that. That's insane.
I know,
That's crazy.
I know. Somebody, we need a representative of the government to argue this case, of why the UK, is in that position. What is the cause, and is it actually factual? Is there some credibility to it? We know that this country has lost a lot of its manufacturing capability, and it's become more or less a service industry. Virtually all jobs in the service, regardless of what they are. Whether they're, you're a lawyer or you're working, like I say, in the fast food or in a supermarket, you are providing a service. You're not actually creating anything. And another real thing is that
I think that's really unfair, though.
Is it?
Yeah, because, bro, if let's say, have you heard of ARM, the chip manufacturers?
No.
They were a massive success story of the UK, and basically what they did was they designed super energy efficient microprocessors years ago when it wasn't really that cool. This is when Steve Jobs was in a nappy, and they just, I mean, it's not literally, I think it was in the 80s, but they carried on developing this technology. When mobile phone technology came out, they wanted processors that used very small amounts of electricity, and they didn't do it on purpose. It was because they were a small Cambridge startup, and I think the equipment that they had couldn't use that much power, or something like that. It was an anomalous quirk of their design that used little power. This company became an international success. Like, every single mobile phone had this technology in it, had this ARM processor, and basically what they did was they were a service business. They didn't manufacture chips.
They
designed the chips, and then some Taiwanese company actually manufactured it. So do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's a service industry.
They were the brains behind the brawn, so to speak.
So to say that they weren't making anything, I think I get what the sentiment behind what you're trying to say, but I think the critics of what we're saying would pounce on examples like that.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, this country is still probably once it was the fourth or the fifth richest country in the world. It still has the money. It does generate money,
but it's very skewed.
Yeah, in virtually different ways other than manufacturing, and but that doesn't filter down to the general public. I mean, why are people's wages so low compared to the GDP?
Yeah. So just to finish off what I was just saying, I just want to be clear. So yeah, there's loads of service industry jobs where you're just because it's a service industry doesn't mean you're not making something. There's another company called Atkins, I think it is, and I think they effectively design nuclear power stations. Bro, that's gonna bring in some money, man.
Yeah.
You're gonna, okay, they're not making anything. They're just what's the word I'm looking for? They're consultants. They just design the systems that are then sort of actually engineered and created by whatever Spain or whichever country. But my point is, service industry isn't something that you hear and you should spit in their face.
Yeah,
it's some of it's kind of funky.
Fair enough. Right. I'm not denigrating the service industry.
Yeah, you were saying that they don't actually make anything.
No, I'm saying maybe that's a possible reason why the wages have kind of plateaued and never gone up. Anyway, we're going to play a few songs now. We'll come back and have a chit chat. Hope you enjoy the show. This is Heritage Radio coming to you from Manchester with Insar and DBK, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
You're listening to Heritage Radio with DBK and Insar.
Hey, wait a minute. How come yours go first and not me?
Because I'm the gobby one, bro. I'm the gobby one.
I'm the quiet, shy, strong,
You're
silent
the deep, reflective one. You're like Aristotle. I'm like
Julius Caesar.
a less dead version. Yeah, do you know what? So yeah, we're talking so far anyway. We're talking about what we're talking about, the economy.
We're talking about we kind of started off with the general election and how it kind of ties in with the economy and standard of living and why 50% of the population don't vote anymore. And to me, my kind of reasoning was that regardless of whoever they vote for, it never really affects their lives in any kind of drastic way.
They sense it's more of the same, basically.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
There's a guy, Alan Greenspan, in America. He used to be the head of the Federal Reserve, right. And I think there was in front of the Senate, I can't remember. He was doing a questions and answers session, and he explained that part of the reason that the economic miracle had happened under his watch, part of the reason was of the creation of job insecurity. Worker insecurity. I mean,
that's think about reason.
Yeah, that's part of the reason was that. And just think about how insane what he's saying is. But I mean, that was very as insidious as it is. It's very prophetic because that was quite a few years ago. And when you see 0 hours contracts now, you can see that it has an immensely beneficial effect in having a very flexible workforce, but the benefits are normally accrued by, obviously
by the employers, by the businesses themselves.
Yeah.
Because if you have a flexible workforce, and like in the good old days, you had Monday to Friday, 9 till 5, people could organise a social life. They could go home to the wife and kids or whatever, holidays, blah blah blah. Now, of course, 0 hours, flexi time, part time.
You got to have a fireman's pole outside your house, jump out your window and get to work.
And that is, something ties in with something else. We did a program not too long ago about mental health and the rise in mental illness in this country. And to me, if you don't have a stable life, if you don't have any permanent kind of security about when you go and when you relax and when you socialize, it can have an effect on your mental health, so to speak. That's my personal opinion. because I like to work and I like to relax. You know, and human beings, we're used to routine. You know, and when you have a lifestyle that is totally kind of chaotic, and you don't know, like, I mean, for instance, some like train drivers and bus drivers, they have to work at different hours. You know, they don't have a set routine anymore. As a bus driver, you can work at one shift in the day, or one shift on the night, or one shift on the weekend.
Which bus drivers you been talking to, bro?
I do.
Are you sure it's not nurses?
Nurses probably, but as bus drivers, I was told when one of my friends applied for the job
way.
You don't. There's no day or night shifts. You can be called in to do a certain number of shifts.
That's horrible.
During the week. Yeah. You know, and the same goes for train drivers as well. You know, you have to kind of. The lack of organisation for one's social life in a job like that can have real detrimental effects on your family life, on your personal life, and ultimately that
your mental health
affects your mental health.
Yeah. That's insane. I'd rather just work like late. Okay, that's fine. Just let me carry on working late or early. I'm happy with that. Just let me carry on working early. One or the other. I think one thing that's important to remember is this is possibly like one of the biggest redistributions over the past 10 years, the biggest redistributions of wealth since like the Victorian era. This is a very profound shift in society.
Definitely.
I almost said amazing. That's awful. It sounds like I'm one of the oligarchy.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. We're heading into an age where you can see in the US and in the UK large swathes of the population living in poverty or below a certain living wage. Everybody's always struggling. There was a recent, not too last year, there was an article about how the banks have shown for quite a while that virtually 16 million people in this country have less than £100 in their bank account.
Yes, but as I've said before, 80% of them are under 10. Okay? No, I'm only joking. But I remember that's a crazy statistic. And then you hear the statistics like in America, which is kind of a barometer of how things will go probably in the UK. There was a statistic that over the past 30 years or so, when you look at, say, 5-year increments, and you look at like this, the nub of this sort of discussion is how the sort of intersection between politics and the economy and people's actual lives, right? And so that means that you should see some changes. You should see some actual changes in your life when you vote one way, Republican or Democrat. You should see some transition. You should see some difference, right? But in America, it's been very predictable, decade after decade after decade. The top 1% of earners, I think they saw wage growth of something like 26%. Really phenomenal wage growth. Good for them. Nice. Middle class people saw like a very moderate wage growth. Again, decade after decade after decade. Very consistent. Republican, Democrat, didn't make any difference. Off something like, I think 5 or 10% or something like that. The majority of people, the people that, I think it is the majority, or let's say blue collar workers, they actually saw a very moderate reductions decade after decade after decade in real world earnings growth. How insane is that? And that those three statistics put together gives you a very what's the word I'm looking for? A very stable basis to form your judgment about the dynamics of how things are going.
And are you saying we're kind of seeing that over here as well?
Yeah,
because we do have a vast majority of the population who do. Like you see, there's a great increase in poverty and a gap between the rich and the poor, we see a huge kind of a discrimination against young people. They can't afford to buy a house anymore without the ability to save enough money because of the high cost of living, the high cost of housing. And the waiting list in this country for housing is absolutely immense. I think it was like 3 million the last time. Probably more depending on, if you kind of include young kids, people under 18, unmarried couples, etc. But kind of wanted to expand it further on what is democracy in this day and age. I mean, do we trust it anymore? Does it have an effect? Does it help us in any way? Or somebody once said, it's not who votes, it's who counts the votes. And what about Brexit. How does Brexit affect the country for the foreseeable future?
I think as much as who counts the votes, it's who's paying for the votes. Bro, we can carry this discussion on if you want, because I've got one other big thing in this area that is, I was going to save it for a future show, but we can talk about it now, because in the same way that graph that I showed you, which by the way, it will be put on our Facebook group in the near future. Check it out, DBK and Insar. We're on Facebook and YouTube. Slowly but surely we'll get our archive online. But
go on, what was on your mind?
So, okay, the second graph, which again makes awful radio, but hopefully I'll be able to try and convey it. Right, so imagine a graph again, horizontal line. You have, let's see, the opinions of the general public, let's say. And then on the vertical axis, so that's the line that goes up and down, it's the, let's see, this is the problem of us being so off the cuff. We do our shows just completely improvised, and sometimes that can be problematic. But basically, what this graph shows is if in archaeology, for example, you have expertise in archaeology, other people have expertise in engineering or in whatever, in sciences. There's a cycle that you have to go through. It's predict, observe, explain. You're going to do an experiment, you make your prediction, then you do your experiment and you write down your observation, and then you ask yourself, how similar is that to the model of reality that I had before I went on this endeavor, right? And if we lived in a perfect democracy, then you would see voting patterns, right? That where people, the more popular a thing is, the more likely it is to go through the Senate or the Parliament or whatever, right? So it should be like a straight line 45-degree graph. Can you visualize that, right? If we live in an oligarchy, it's not going to look like that. If we live in a kleptocracy, that's a system or a country where large swathes of industry and natural resources are sort of are taken by powerful private interest families and dynasties, then basically if you live in that country, it will not be a 45-degree graph, right? And so basically what you find is it very definitely isn't like that. The opinion of 75% plus percent of the population is almost irrelevant. It makes no difference. If we all said we want to have
no war in Iraq,
exactly, right? If 92% of people said that, it makes absolutely no difference to the actual implementation of law. But when you look at the top fraction of the top fraction of wealth in a given country, and you ask the same sort of question, how do the voting patterns or opinions of this group, how does that change voting policy? And then you see a perfect 45-degree graph. And this is done by respectable academics that do research in political sciences and things like this. And so it very clearly is a nice piece of empirical evidence that shows that wealth determines the way that law is made.
You talked about this before once, you mentioned it.
Probably, I've only got three things.
No, I think I saw this somewhere, but there's like you have a kind of a three-tier system. You have the working class, what effect do they have on the voting system, on democracy and policies in this country, and it's virtually nominal. Then you have the middle class, what effect do they have on the policies of this country, left or right or this way or that way, and that is marginal. It has a little bit, but the vast majority of influence comes from the elites, comes from the rich and powerful. They sway the politicians. It's the corporations that determine what governments will do, what direction they will lead, and ultimately we can second guess what Brexit was all about, but for many people they see it as a kind of a battle of power on higher levels.
Oh yeah, that we did a show about that.
So I think I totally agree with you there. It is in the tiny minority at the top, the elite. They determine the real democratic process of this country, and not the vast majority, which has always been represented as the case, which it isn't. Right, I'm going to come back in a minute. We can play a few songs, and I hope you enjoy, and stay tuned.